Why would the Han Dynasty go from a sword like this to one like this? Hey guys, it's Scholar Juno, more Jian and Bing. It's been a minute since I made a video. I apologize. I want to make more often, but life happens, and let's see what we can do in the future. But today here, I have the Chen White Arc Han Jian, and then I also have the Royal Arsenal Han Dao, and both of these blades are about as different as you could get. But what's interesting is that the infantry of the Han Dynasty was using blades more like this Han Jian, and then they switched to using blades like the Royal Arsenal Han Dao. So in this video, what we're going to do first is talk about that history and why that change occurred, and then I'm going to go into the details of the Jian and the Dao, and then we'll do some cutting and have some fun. Like all these other Chen sword reviews that I've been doing lately, these ones were sent to me for a video review, and then I will be sending them back, so do with that what you will. But let's get into it. Let's talk about the White Arc Han Jian. In my last video, I reviewed the two Chen Bamian Jian, or 8-sided Jian, and one of those two was the Han Dynasty Bamian Jian. However, in this video, the White Arc is a little bit different. You'll notice this sword actually has a flattened diamond cross-section, and so it would be called a 4-sided Jian, or Simian Jian. Because this Jian is supposed to represent what kind of the run-of-the-mill soldier would get, it's a lot less ornate than the Soaring Sky Jian, the 8-sided Jian. For example, the fittings on here, it's the pommel is just a very simple brass ovular pommel cap, and then the guard is just a regular cross guard that's very tiny. It does have kind of a mark on the left side of the guard. I'm not sure why exactly that's there, but it does give it something nice, at least that's not completely plain. Grip here is just a simple forward wrapped handle. It does provide a pretty good grip. As you can see, the grip of mine has loosened up slightly and it has a little bit of movement in there. Now, that's something that's fairly common with most swords that I've handled. If you use them enough, the grip's going to start to loosen up. Another way that the White Arc Jian is not as fancily decorated as the Soaring Sky Jian is in the scabbard. So if you remember the Soaring Sky Jian scabbard, it was was decked out with all this kind of fancy stuff. This one is basically a plain wooden scabbard. It has a little bit of paint on it, and it has a wooden belt loop, and in addition to that, it has a single brass shape on there. So a much simpler design, a much more utilitarian design, which makes sense if it's used in the military. As you can see, this Han Dynasty White Arc Jian is a very long blade. It's almost a meter long, like 95 centimeters, something like that. And it also, has a diamond cross section, which can be quite rigid, but it does have distal taper. And what this means is that, out on the tip, it becomes a little bit flexible. Some people may wonder how the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago made blades that were this long, and, they made a lot of them, and they were useful in warfare. The answer lies in, of course, metallurgy. Basically, Han Dynasty metallurgy was pretty advanced for the time, and there are some antique collectors who are way braver than me, and they take their 2,000-year-old Han Dynasty Jian, and then they give it a good bend, and then watch it spring back to true. For one, if you ever have a Han Dynasty Jian, don't do that. That seems very risky and could damage a priceless artifact. For two, because they're brave enough to do it, we know that they were spring tempering some of these Jian. However, I would like to say that even though I've seen some antique collectors do this with their Han Dynasty Jian, I haven't seen an archaeometallurgical study which looks at the Han Dynasty Jian under the microscope and confirms that the steel is actually tempered martensite. If anybody knows of a study that does that, please leave a link to that in the description below. It's a little pedantic, but I do like to try and back up all my claims with scholarly peer-reviewed evidence. So if I say that these are spring-tempered, I'm going off the people who are messing around with the antiques and not from a particular journal. However, I do think that it would kind of be impossible to make a blade like this if it wasn't spring-tempered, because it would bend way too easy. And it's just a little bit too narrow and too thin here, and you kind of need that springiness to keep it from just taking a big set every time you hit something with it. So if you're a soldier in the Han Dynasty and you have this nice meter-long blade that you can reach out and stick people with if you're from your own horseback or, using it with a shield. Why would you let go of this Jian and then start using something like this? This is the Royal Arsenal Han Dao, and it's different to the Royal Arc Jian in just about every way you can imagine. For one, the blade length. It's about half the blade length, and it's only single-edged. It's not straight. It has actually a slight forward curve. So this Royal Arsenal Han Dao is super lightweight. It's like really lightweight. Like you can just kind of swing it, right? And it's a lot of fun. It feels nice. However, it's based off an original, and the original was actually about 100 grams lighter than this. The one I have here is about 580 grams, and the original that it's based off of was about 470. And Chen basically looked at the original and added mass to this one based off, the corrosion that would have occurred over those 2,000 years. And I should say that I do think that some of these Han Dynasty Dao would be even heavier than this one. I think that this one might be a little bit on the light side, but even so, it's still a fairly small weapon, and it's a fairly quick and nimble weapon. And it has a ring pommel. There's a lot of differences, but why would they switch to using something like this? First thing I should say is that switching to the Dao wasn't really the soldier's choice, it was the choice of the institution of the military during the Han Dynasty. And this change happened sometime during the reign of Han Wudi, around 150 BC or so. I think that there's a few reasons why the Han Dynasty decided to switch from the Jian to the Dao, and the reason I'm going to give aren't in particular order, they're just going out there. And the first reason that I'm going to say is economics. So, making, 100,000 Han Dynasty Dao like this is a lot easier than making 100,000 Jian. And you have to think, this is about half the blade length. Imagine that's half the material, right? So that's a huge cost saver. In addition to that, you only have a single edge. You don't have to spend as much time grinding the steel. Another reason has to do with utility and durability. One thing to understand about these Han Dynasty Dao is that they were not created just out of the blue. Basically, before they switched to this Dao, there were a bunch of utility knives floating around that would be quite a bit shorter, but they would have the ring pommel. A lot of them were used actually for secretarial work because they would ride on like strips of bamboo, and if you don't have an eraser, so what you do is you get a little knife and you scrape it off. And those little scraping knives pretty much resemble one of these, just downscaled a little bit. So they already had these knives floating around, and they're like, well, let's just take this and make it a little bit bigger. So militaries frequently like to make their weapons abuse-proof because soldiers will abuse their weapons. So having a Dao that has this nice, rigid, solid spine and doesn't have a second edge that can be messed with, and you just take this edge or the point and you stick it in them or take a chop at them. It's pretty simple to use. The scabbard on this Han Dao just has 3 brass fittings. One of them is your belt loop, and it's pretty small and handy. And just like the sword, it also fits in there pretty nicely and has a nice click whenever you put it in the scabbard. So that's pretty good. And this one thing I really like about this sword is just how convenient it would be to carry around. You're not going to wear out your infantry on a big march if this is what they have to carry around. And now we get to the ring pommel, the good old ring pommel. So I made a video about ring pommels a while ago, and I do plan on doing another one again sometime soon because there's a lot more to say. Now, in the past, I mentioned that these Han Dynasty Dao, they might be used where you could stick a peg in the wall like this, and you could just have a whole bunch of Dao hanging on the wall like that. It's a very convenient way to store a whole lot of Dao. However, I should say that we don't have any conclusive evidence for that. And most, inscriptions or depictions of weapons in the Han Dynasty, especially ones that are like being stored on a rack or something, they almost always show the weapons being stored horizontally and not vertically. So I'm not saying that, they didn't, hang their Dao on pegs on the wall, but we don't have super solid evidence for that. Additionally, there's also some artistic depictions which show like a lanyard or a wrist loop being put on the ring pommel so you can, prevent the Dao from falling or if it slips from your hand or anything like that. And there's another reason why I think they did that, but I'll hold off on it for a second. So aside from economics and durability, I think that there's one more reason why the Han Dynasty would decide to switch to the Dao, and I think part of it actually has to do with use. An important thing to understand about these weapons during the Han Dynasty is that they would be used with a shield. And earlier in the Han Dynasty, the shields were fairly small, and just larger than buckler size. And they also had the buckler, the Gorong. And I'm not going to talk about that right now, but in the main infantry, they would have shields. And the shields increased in size, especially around the time when they switched to the Dao. And I don't think that's a coincidence, because whenever I was swinging the Jian around, it felt really good. I could do all kinds of nimble cutting with it. I also tried to, swing it around holding a stick, which could represent, a center grip shield, or, like the Gorong or something. And then I also tried using it with my Tengpai. Now, I should say that the Tengpai that I have is nothing like what existed during the Han Dynasty, but certain things about shields, large shields, still hold true regardless of what type they are in some ways. And I found that, and whenever I was using the White Arc Jian with my Tengpai shield, I felt like the length was kind of interfering with my maneuverability, because I couldn't conceal the weapon very well. It was very long, and I could get good reach, but if I have a shield in my hand, I don't need to reach as far in the first place, because I can, absorb a couple hits on my shield while I'm going in. Whenever I was using the Royal Arsenal Han Dao, this is a weapon I would not want to use in a duel. It's quite short, and it doesn't have much hand protection at all, and it's light, and you can, swing it around really fast, but I just think the lack of reach would be just very deadly if you went up against someone with, like, the Baihu Jian. But whenever I was using it with the shield, this weapon just made a whole lot more sense, which is why I think that the infantry adopted it, because basically you can maneuver this weapon around your shield. And I don't think it's a coincidence that, other cultures they use large shields, such as the Romans, also used short blades. And this also even goes to China during like the Qing dynasty, when you have the Tengpai and the Pai Dao, that type of thing. So I believe that part of the transition from Jian to Dao was due to the use and the increase in size of shields over the course of the Han Dynasty. So to kind of sum up, I think that the Han Dynasty switched to the Dao because it's much cheaper to produce a lot of Dao like this, and the Dao can be more soldier-proof, it's more resistant to being abused, and this type of Dao also works very well with a large shield. And the Jian is a little more awkward with that large shield. But now I want to talk about thrusting, because many who have reviewed this weapon before me have commented on this handguard and how it will not prevent your hand from sliding up on the blade if you use a thrust. And I did something very foolish that no one should do, but I decided to test this out. So, I got a pretty strong grip on the Dao, and then I, tried to stab a board against a tree. And yes, I can confirm that your hand does indeed slide up onto the blade. Thankfully, I was not cut too badly at all, but still, something that the buyer should be aware of. However, now we go back to this ring pommel. So having a lanyard here will prevent you from losing the blade if you accidentally drop it or something. But more importantly, I think, if this ring pommel lanyard is, pretty tight around your wrist, you can actually thrust at full force without incurring the risk of your hand sliding up on the blade. So, I put a lanyard on the Dao, and then I went and I stabbed the same board several times, tried to put my mass and weight into the jab, and I felt at no point was I at risk of my hand sliding up on the blade as it had before. So because you can't really stab with this blade unless you have a lanyard on there, I do think it's probably a good idea for LK Chen to include a lanyard. You might have to fit it yourself, because one size won't necessarily fit all wrists, but it might be important to put that on there, because it would, for one, be safer, because people won't do what I did, which was pretty dumb, but also many of the artistic depictions do indeed show lanyards on these Dao, so that would be one more step to making it, closer to historical accuracy. So as you can see, both of these blades do an excellent job cutting water bottles. I think that the blade geometry and the distal taper on the Han Jian really make it quite easy to cut through water bottles. But I would think that it takes a little more effort to punch through harder targets. And likewise, this Han Dao, because it's light and very fast, it also cuts through water bottles, with very easily and feels great. But I do think it would be more of a struggle to cut through very dense, hard targets. And that just goes to put these weapons in the context of their time. Han soldiers would definitely have some armor, but the enemies that they fought would not always have, iron armor. And if they don't have a lot of armor a lot of the time, or the armor isn't fully covering all their body, then you don't necessarily need to have heavy hitting weapons. I have to say, I personally prefer the Dao, but everybody should know that going in, I'm kind of a Dao guy. So I really love this thing. It's a lot of fun to swing around. And make sure you put a tassel on it if you're going to stab things. So in conclusion, I think that these are both two cool Han Dynasty weapons. If you're a big fan of the Han Dynasty, you should definitely check them out. And if you want to just have fun cutting up water bottles, you can also consider these weapons. Thank you all for watching. Please subscribe and don't forget to stay sharp.